January 1942. A world at war, frozen, burning, and broken all at once. Across the Russian steppe, wind howls through the shattered shells of villages buried under snow. German tanks, their engines coughing in the bitter cold, sat motionless, the invasion that promised quick victory now strangled by ice and exhaustion, half a world away. In the Pacific, the wreckage of Pearl Harbor still smolders beneath the waves. American sailors raise flags over twisted steel, vowing retribution for a nation stunned awake. Japanese troops marched through jungles from the Philippines to Malaya, their empire expanding like wildfire in North Africa. British and German forces claw through deserts of dust and flame, where each mile of sand is paid for in blood. Everywhere, empires hold their breath. Every nation, its fate uncertain. The Axis seems unstoppable, the Allies fractured and outmatched. But beneath the chaos, something begins to stir: industry, willpower, and defiance. Because 1942 would not be another year of loss, it would become the year the tide began to turn. By the dawn of 1942, the Axis powers seemed invincible. In less than 3 years, Adolf Hitler's armies had conquered most of Europe. The swastika flew from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow. Nazi banners hung over Paris, Warsaw, and Athens. Across the continent, Allied resistance appeared broken, scattered, and exhausted. In the east, Operation Barbarossa, Germany's titanic invasion of the Soviet Union, had advanced farther than any campaign in human history. Millions of Soviet soldiers had fallen, thousands of towns and cities reduced to rubble. The Wehrmacht's steel tide reached the gates of Moscow by December 1941. The world watched for the fall of the Soviet capital, expecting Stalin's empire to collapse in the snow. Yet the Soviet Union did not break. Its cities burned, its armies bled, but its people dug in. Behind the frozen walls of Moscow, soldiers and civilians alike clung to survival. When the Red Army counterattacked that winter, it was not victory, but it was the first crack in the myth of German invincibility. Far to the west, Great Britain remained the lone bastion of defiance in Europe. Winston Churchill's island fortress had survived the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, but victory remained distant. Supplies were dwindling, convoys were being hunted by German U-boats, and the empire's reach was stretched across the globe from the Middle East to the Indian Ocean. Britain fought on, but it could not defeat the Axis alone. Then came the final shock. The Pacific exploded. On December 7, 1941, Japan struck Pearl Harbor, a thunderclap that reshaped the world. Within hours, the rising sun swept across the Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines were encircled. The Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the seas with terrifying precision, sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. What had begun as a European war now became truly global. For the United States, the first months of 1942 were a brutal awakening. American forces in the Pacific were unprepared, undermanned, and scattered across vast ocean distances. Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines fell one after another. Thousands of American and Filipino troops were captured, their ordeal culminating in the infamous Boat and Death March, a grim testament to Japan's ferocity and the Allies' vulnerability. Everywhere, Axis banners advanced. In North Africa, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, launched his daring offensives across Libya and Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and Britain's access to Middle Eastern oil. His Afrika Korps, though smaller in number, struck with lightning precision, outmaneuvering British armor in the endless dunes. To the British command, it seemed as if even the desert itself favored the Germans. In Asia, Japanese bombers struck Rangoon and Colombo. The British Empire, already strained by years of war in Europe, began to crumble under the speed and coordination of Japan's campaigns. India and Australia now stood exposed, fearing invasion. Allied forces fell back in confusion, unable to comprehend the scale and efficiency of their enemy. By spring 1942, Axis propaganda boasted of a new world order, an empire stretching from Norway to New Guinea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For millions it seemed unstoppable that the Allies had suffered humiliation after humiliation, defeat after defeat. Their morale sank under the weight of endless losses. Even in Washington and London, uncertainty prevailed. How could the free nations of the world fight enemies that controlled nearly every resource, every port, and every sky? Yet, amid the chaos, a realization began to take hold. This was no longer a war of conquest or territory. It had become a war of survival, of endurance, production, and unity. Factories that once built cars now forged tanks and bombers. Women filled the assembly lines. Scientists, strategists, and soldiers began working toward one goal: to halt the Axis tide before it consumed everything. 1942 opened with fear. But within that fear lay something else: determination. The world had reached its breaking point, and the next months would decide whether freedom itself would endure. The early defeats of 1942 forced the Allies to confront a grim truth: they could no longer fight as separate nations. The British Empire, the Soviet Union, China, and now the United States had to act as one, or perish one by one. At the heart of this realization was logistics. the lifeblood of modern warfare. Factories, shipyards, and oil refineries became as vital as armies. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy. Across America, the sound of industry replaced the silence of despair. In Detroit, automobile plants were retooled to produce bombers instead of cars. Women poured into the workforce by the millions, assembling rifles, welding steel, driving trucks, and stitching parachutes. Within months, the United States transformed from an unprepared observer into the world's greatest industrial war machine. Yet production alone could not win the war. And in 1942, leadership meant clarity under chaos. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his top generals George C. Marshall, Ernest King, and Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible question: where to fight first. The Pacific demanded immediate revenge for Pearl Harbor, but the heart of the Axis still beat in Europe. Churchill pressed Roosevelt to strike Hitler's soft underbelly through North Africa. Stalin demanded a second front in France to relieve the bloodletting on the Eastern Front. No single answer could satisfy all. It was in this crucible that the Allies forged the framework for global coordination. The combined chiefs of staff, the joint planning committees, and the strategy conferences that would define the rest of the war. Every convoy, every bombing run, every amphibious assault from 1942 onward would be decided through hard negotiation and shared sacrifice across the Atlantic. Britain was equally transformed. Though battered and stretched thin, it had something no one else did experience. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park continued to unravel German Enigma transmissions, giving the Allies glimpses into Axis movements that no radar could detect. Royal Air Force squadrons, once fighting alone in 1940, now trained thousands of pilots from Canada, Australia, and Poland. The Royal Navy kept the Atlantic lifelines open against relentless U-boat wolfpacks. And under Churchill's unyielding voice, Britain's people held the line, rationing, rebuilding, and refusing to surrender hope. Meanwhile, in the East, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union fought on with unimaginable ferocity. By 1942, entire cities had been swallowed by the front. Industrial plants were dismantled and hauled thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe, only to be rebuilt and produce tanks within weeks. Women and children worked 12-hour shifts in frozen factories. Soviet engineers rolled out the T-3 for a tank, both rugged and deadly, faster than the Germans could destroy them. For every town lost, the Soviets vowed to take one back. Their resilience would become one of the greatest human efforts in military history. Then Asia. China's vast manpower tied down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops, while guerrilla fighters in Burma, Malaya, and the Philippines harassed enemy supply lines. The war had become a web, one front influencing another. Every loss and victory echoing across continents. The psychological balance began to shift as well. The Allied nations started to believe that the Axis could be beaten not through speed, but through endurance. They studied their enemies' weaknesses: Japan's overextended supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean, Germany's arrogance and reliance on lightning war tactics, Italy's faltering campaigns in North Africa. For the first time since 1939, a pattern of resistance began to form from the Soviet snows to the Coral Sea. The Allies didn't yet know it, but the key battles that would decide the fate of the war were approaching. They would unfold across oceans, deserts, and ruined cities in places whose names would echo through history. Midway, El Alamein, Stalingrad, Guadalcanal, each would mark a turning point. Each would push the Axis closer to the edge. By mid-1942, the world stood balanced between darkness and dawn. The Axis still held more ground, but the Allies had discovered something the enemy could not measure: unity, production, and the power of human resolve. And as spring turned to summer, the time came to test it, because 1942 would not be remembered for how far the Axis advanced, but for how, at last, they began to fall. Every great turning point begins not in strategy rooms, but in the mud, snow, and sea where men fought and died. In 1942, war had consumed entire generations. Soldiers on every front, from the frozen banks of the Volga to the burning decks of the Coral Sea, were no longer the eager recruits of 1939. They were hardened, disillusioned, and enduring what no human should. On the Eastern Front, Soviet infantry fought not for territory but for survival. Frostbitten hands gripped rifles worn smooth by endless combat. Civilians starved beside the trenches, yet refused to abandon their ruined cities. Every house became a fortress, every street a graveyard. The Red Army's courage was not born of ideology, but of desperation, the knowledge that behind them lay their homes, their families, and nothing else in the Pacific. Young American sailors and Marines fought in jungles they'd never heard of: Bataan, Guadalcanal, and New Guinea. Disease, heat, and exhaustion claimed nearly as many as bullets, yet their spirit grew harder with every loss. They learned to adapt, to fight in swamps and coral reefs, and to face an enemy who never surrendered. In North Africa, British, Indian, Australian, and New Zealand troops lived under the same relentless sun, their tanks choking on sand while supply convoys vanished under German ambushes. Still, they fought because there was nowhere left to retreat. By 1942, the war had stripped away illusions. There were no more quick victories, only endurance and the belief that somehow it would be enough, while soldiers bore the suffering. Engineers and scientists reshaped the battlefield from behind the lines. 1942 marked the year when warfare became a contest of technology as much as bravery. In the skies, aircraft evolved faster than ever before. The Japanese Zero, once unmatched, began to meet its challengers, the rugged American F-4F Wildcat and the British Spitfire. MKV dogfights now stretched across oceans. Pilots learned to rely on radar and coordinated tactics rather than instinct alone. At sea, the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the true ruler of the waves. At Midway and the Coral Sea, planes launched from decks hundreds of miles apart decided the fate of fleets without a single shot fired from naval guns. Steel hulls gave way to air power and the ocean itself became a chessboard on land. Tanks evolved from lumbering machines into fast, deadly predators. Germany's Panzer IVs and Tigers seemed unstoppable, but the Soviets countered with the T-34, simple, strong, and suited to the vast Russian terrain. Its sloped armor deflected shells, and its reliability in mud and snow gave the Red Army a new edge. Meanwhile, the British developed the Grant and Sherman tanks, soon to become the backbone of Allied armored warfare. Invisible innovations proved just as crucial. Radar, sonar, and cryptography became weapons of silence. At Bletchley Park, codebreakers quietly turned the tide, intercepting messages that saved convoys and revealed Axis plans. In the Pacific, American cryptologists broke Japan's naval code, setting the stage for the victory at Midway. 1942 was the year when the tools of war learned to think, listen, and deceive, and when victory began to depend not only on courage, but on calculation. Leadership in 1942 was not about ambition. It was about survival under impossible pressure. Across the world, men carried the weight of nations on their shoulders. In Washington, General George C. Marshall crafted a global war plan from fragments. His calm precision and ability to delegate shaped the American command structure that would later lead to Normandy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed just after Pearl Harbor, transformed a shattered Pacific fleet into a lethal force built around carriers and submarines. His patience and quiet resolve would soon change the course of the Pacific. In London, Churchill remained unbroken. He slept little, wrote constantly, and spoke with defiance that kept a weary empire alive. Behind him, a network of officers and scientists worked tirelessly to keep Britain's pulse steady, feeding intelligence, managing shortages, and coordinating with Roosevelt through telegrams that spanned oceans. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin ruled through fear and necessity. His leadership was brutal, often paranoid but effective. He demanded impossible sacrifices, and his generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky delivered them. Their counterattacks around Moscow proved that the Red Army could not only defend but strike back, and in Berlin and Tokyo, the Axis leaders began to reveal their greatest weakness: arrogance. Hitler believed his own myths of destiny, ignoring his generals' warnings. He divided his armies, chasing glory at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, overextending his reach. In Tokyo, the Japanese High Command celebrated early victories but failed to grasp the scale of American industry and the cost of prolonged war. In 1942, leadership was a test of vision and of restraint. Those who adapted would survive. Those who clung to pride would fall. In early 1942, the Axis world believed itself unstoppable. Germany, Italy, and Japan had carved empires across 3 continents. Their banners fluttered over conquered capitals. Their leaders spoke of the destiny of an order that would last 1,000 years. Hitler saw the war in the East as already won. After all, the Wehrmacht had driven deep into the Soviet heartland, capturing millions of prisoners and obliterating entire armies. The Führer stood before his generals, boasting that the Soviet Union is finished. Plans were already underway to reshape conquered lands, new borders, new colonies, a Europe ruled from Berlin. In the Pacific, Japan's admirals basked in their triumph. From December 1941 to May 1942, their navy had achieved one of the most astonishing sequences of victories in modern history, sinking Allied fleets, capturing vast territories, and humiliating Western empires. The rising sun now stretched from the Indian Ocean to the edge of Hawaii. Tokyo's war cabinet envisioned an empire self-sufficient in oil, rubber, and rice, a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere built upon conquest and obedience. Yet within their victories, seeds of defeat were already sown. Germany had stretched itself too far, fighting from the Arctic to North Africa without secure supply lines. Japan's empire sprawled across thousands of islands, requiring ships, fuel, and men it could never fully replace. While Axis leaders saw conquest, their soldiers began to see exhaustion. German troops on the Eastern Front were freezing, hungry, and disillusioned. Japanese sailors realized that each victory brought them farther from home and closer to a vast, awakening enemy. The arrogance that had fueled early success began to blind the Axis to reality. Their enemies were learning faster, adapting better, and uniting with purpose. By the time they noticed, the balance had already begun to shift. 1942 was not only a military turning point, it was a moral one. As the Axis reached the height of its power, Its darkest crimes came into focus. In occupied Europe, entire populations lived under terror. German forces deported millions to forced labor camps. The machinery of the Holocaust began its most systematic phase. Ghettos emptied into death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. The world would not fully grasp the scale until years later, but already whispers of horror reached London, Moscow, and Washington. The war was no longer just about land or power. It was about civilization itself. In Asia, Japan's occupation brought brutal repression. From Nanking to Manila, civilians endured massacres, forced labor, and famine. Prisoners of war were treated with unimaginable cruelty. For Allied soldiers who witnessed these acts firsthand, the war ceased to be only about strategy. It became a personal fight for the right to exist in a world free from tyranny. On the home fronts, civilians endured their own forms of sacrifice. London's families slept in underground shelters during air raids. Soviet families starved to keep factories running. In America, families accepted rationing blackouts and the absence of loved ones who had gone to distant oceans. This moral shift gave the Allies something the Axis could never manufacture: conviction, the understanding that defeat meant not just the loss of nations but of humanity itself. And that conviction would carry them through the darkest months to come, while soldiers and civilians bore the human cost. The factories of democracy roared to life. In 1942, industry became the true battlefield. The United States, now fully mobilized, unleashed an industrial revolution unlike anything in human history. In a single year, American factories produced 48,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping. Entire cities became engines of war. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, their skylines glowed with the light of furnaces that never slept. Women, immigrants, and minorities filled the assembly lines, welding the future into steel and aluminum. Rosie the Riveter became more than propaganda. She was the face of a nation learning that unity could be its greatest weapon. Britain, despite the bombing, increased its own production. The Soviet Union, working under starvation and cold, outproduced Germany in tanks and artillery. Every month, thousands of weapons rolled out of factories hidden in the Ural Mountains. What the Axis had conquered by aggression, the Allies would reclaim by sheer productivity. And behind every shipment and convoy lay risk. The Battle of the Atlantic raged as U-boats hunted Allied supply lines. For every tanker that reached Britain, another might vanish beneath the waves. Yet the convoys kept sailing, escorted by destroyers, guided by sonar, protected by code breakers who deciphered German positions. By the end of 1942, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible: a sustainable, global system of production and supply. They could replace what was lost faster than the Axis could destroy it. The war's momentum was shifting not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, shipyards, and the silent nights of workers who believed their labor could win a war. The Axis powers still appeared strong, but the truth was changing beneath the surface. Their victories masked exhaustion. Their enemies were learning faster, producing more, and beginning to strike back with precision. The storm was gathering, and soon, two battles would define everything, one on the seas of the Pacific, the other in the ruins of a Soviet city on the Volga. June 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific still burned. The Japanese Empire had advanced across thousands of miles from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean. Its navy, the most powerful ever assembled in the East, sailed with an aura of invincibility. But beneath that surface of confidence, Japan faced an invisible enemy. American intelligence officers, working in windowless rooms in Pearl Harbor and Melbourne, had broken Japan's naval code, known as JN-25. Every radio transmission, every movement order, every logistic report was carefully pieced together like a vast, deadly puzzle. By May 1942, U.S. cryptologists under Commander Joseph Rochefort had uncovered something critical. Japan was planning a massive assault on a location identified only as AF. The Americans had their suspicions and set a trap by sending a false message from Midway atoll claiming that its water supply was failing. They waited to see if the Japanese would repeat it in coded form. When Tokyo did, the truth was clear. AF meant Midway, a tiny cluster of coral islands, halfway between Asia and America. The trap was set. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, faced staggering odds. Japan's fleet outnumbered him in carriers, battleships, and aircraft. Yet Nimitz saw opportunity where others saw doom. He gathered every available carrier, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown and positioned them northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon. The Japanese, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, expected to lure the remaining U.S. fleet into a trap of their own. Their confidence was absolute. Their pilots were elite, their carrier crews flawless. On June 4th, they launched waves of bombers against Midway's airfields, pounding the island into smoke and flame. But as the Japanese celebrated their initial success, their fleet unknowingly sailed into the jaws of history. American scout planes found them first. One radioed back, "Enemy sighted." Moments later, the entire Pacific War hinged on timing, altitude, and chance. The first American strikes failed disastrously. Torpedo squadrons from Hornet and Enterprise attacked head-on without fighter cover. One by one, they were shot down, 37 out of 41 planes destroyed. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his men died without landing a single hit. For an hour it seemed Midway would end as another American tragedy, but their sacrifice bought time. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared high above the Japanese fleet just as Japanese flight decks were being refueled and rearmed for a second strike. The sky erupted. In less than 5 minutes, everything changed. Commander Wade McCluskey's squadrons dove through clouds of anti-aircraft fire, releasing bombs that turned the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryo into infernos. Planes, fuel, and ammunition ignited in chain explosions that ripped through their decks. Crews leaped into burning seas. By noon, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were gone, burning wrecks sinking beneath black smoke. Yamamoto's remaining carrier, Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack, striking Yorktown and crippling her. But American planes soon found Hiryu as well, and by sunset, she too lay aflame. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 carriers, over 300 aircraft, and most of its veteran pilots. The same elite flyers who had attacked Pearl Harbor. For the first time since 1937, Japan's war machine staggered. The loss could not be replaced. Their shipyards lacked the industrial power to rebuild quickly, and their pilot training programs could not produce replacements fast enough. The Pacific had turned not in months of grinding attrition, but in one breathtaking moment of courage, intelligence, and precision. At Pearl Harbor, sailors had watched their fleet sink in fire. At Midway, they watched the enemies burn instead. The strategic balance of the entire war shifted on that June morning. Never again would Japan take the offensive in the Pacific. From this point forward, it would fight to defend, retreating island by island, step by step, as the United States and its allies pushed westward across the ocean. For Nimitz, the victory was not one of luck, but of preparation. For America, it was redemption. For the world, it was proof that the Axis could bleed and lose, as the flames of Midway faded into the night sky. Across the world, another storm was gathering, not on water but on frozen ground in the east. A city on the Volga River was about to become the graveyard of an empire. Summer 1942. Across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath a roar of vengeance. German panzer divisions, scarred but still deadly, rolled east once more. Their target, the city on the Volga. For Hitler it was more than a military objective. It was symbolic of the city bearing Stalin's name, the gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus, and the key to crushing Soviet resistance. For both dictators, Stalingrad became personal. The German advance began with unstoppable speed. Luftwaffe bombers turned the city into a wasteland of rubble and twisted iron. Streets vanished, beneath smoke and shattered brick. Yet within that destruction, the Soviet defense dug in not in trenches, but in basements, factories, and the ruins of homes. By September, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had pushed deep into the city, capturing most of it. They believed the end was near. But what they didn't see that they couldn't see was that the city itself was swallowing them whole. The Soviet commander, General Vasily Chukov, turned Stalingrad into a nightmare battlefield. His soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, with grenades, knives, and sheer will. The front lines were often separated by a single wall, Germans on one side, Soviets on the other. It was a world reduced to meters, not miles. A German soldier wrote in his diary, "We are fighting for every stairwell, rats, corpses, smoke and the cold. We no longer fight for Hitler, we fight to live." Every hour drained German strength. The Luftwaffe's bombs that once promised victory now filled the air with dust so thick even tanks could not move. Soviet snipers haunted the ruins, men like Vasily Zaitsev who turned the shattered city into his hunting ground. But beyond the suffering, the Red Army was preparing something far greater. In the icy steppe north and south of the city, Soviet generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky gathered fresh armies not to defend, but to strike. Their plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, aimed not at Stalingrad itself, but at the weaker Axis armies guarding its flanks. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions stretched thin across hundreds of miles. On November 19, 1942, the steppe exploded. Soviet artillery roared for hours. Then waves of T-34 tanks and infantry surged forward under a blizzard of snow and smoke. Within 4 days, the pincers met at Kalak, west of Stalingrad, trapping 330,000 Axis troops, including the entire German Sixth Army, inside a frozen cauldron. The hunters had become the hunted. Desperate, Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his ground, no surrender, no retreat. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the army by air. But the promise was impossible. The winter skies swallowed the plains. The airfields froze. Supplies dwindled to nothing. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, soldiers starved. They boiled leather belts, ate frozen horseflesh, even resorted to the unthinkable. Frostbite blackened limbs. Ammunition ran out. Yet Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Stand fast. Outside, Soviet guns closed the ring tighter each day. By January 1943, Paulus's army was collapsing. The city that once symbolized victory had become a tomb. When Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, he expected him to die in battle. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive, but on February 2, 1943, surrounded by silence and snow, Paulus surrendered. Of the 330,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, fewer than 100,000 survived to march into captivity, and fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. For the first time, the Wehrmacht, the most feared army in the world, had been decisively, irreversibly defeated. Across Europe, a whisper spread through the occupied lands. The Germans can be beaten, and in the snow of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had proven it. As the smoke cleared, Stalin stood before his generals and said, "Now is not the end. It is the beginning of the end." From this moment, the Red Army would never again retreat. The Germans would be pushed back through Kursk, through Kiev, through Warsaw, all the way to Berlin. The war's momentum had changed forever in the Pacific. America was advancing island by island. In Europe, the Red Army was awakening with vengeance. The Axis powers, once unstoppable, now faced the grinding weight of total war, a war they could no longer win. While the snows of Stalingrad buried Hitler's Eastern dream, another battle, half a world away, was deciding the fate of the Mediterranean. The North African desert, endless and unforgiving, had become the proving ground for modern mechanized warfare. And by mid-1942, that desert belonged to the Axis. At its heart stood one man, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His Afrika Korps had pushed the British Eighth Army back more than 1,000 miles, from Libya to the gates of Egypt. Cairo trembled. The Suez Canal, Britain's vital link to India, the Middle East, and its empire, was within reach. If Rommel broke through, the entire Allied position in the Middle East could collapse. The world held its breath. But in August 1942, the British government made a critical change. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, desperate for victory, appointed a new commander, General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was calm, methodical, and relentlessly disciplined, the exact opposite of Rommel's daring improvisation. He rebuilt morale, reorganized logistics, and gathered overwhelming firepower. "Victory will be a hard and bloody business," he told his men, "but we will win because we must." By late October, the time had come. At El Alamein, west of Cairo, two armies faced each other with more than 200,000 men on each side. Thousands of tanks and guns spread across the desert plain. On October 23, 1942, at exactly 21:40 hours, the night erupted in thunder. British and Commonwealth artillery unleashed the largest barrage since the First World War. Over 1,000 guns firing in perfect coordination, lighting the desert like lightning storms. For 12 days, the battle raged across minefields and dunes. Tank duels flared at dawn and dusk, the air filled with sand, smoke, and the metallic scent of war. Rommel, ill and exhausted, returned from Germany mid-battle to find his army faltering. Fuel shortages strangled his mobility. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. His supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean were collapsing under relentless Allied naval attacks. By November 4, Montgomery's Eighth Army broke through. The German and Italian forces began a full retreat, the longest, most humiliating withdrawal Rommel would ever order for the first time in the war. The British army had decisively defeated the Germans on land. Churchill, jubilant but weary, announced to Parliament, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we shall never have a defeat." But El Alamein was only half of the turning point. Even as Rommel retreated westward, another blow was about to fall, this time from the sea. On November 8, 1942, waves of American and British troops landed along the coasts of French North Africa. Operation Torch. It was the first major Allied amphibious operation of the war and the first time American ground forces faced the Germans. Convoys crossed the Atlantic under constant threat of U-boats, carrying over 100,000 soldiers to the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. They faced not the Germans at first, but Vichy French forces, the remnants of France's collaborationist regime. The fighting was brief and confused. Within days, the French garrisons joined the Allies. Rommel now found himself trapped between two armies, Montgomery advancing from the east, Eisenhower's newly arrived Americans from the west. By early 1943, the Axis position in North Africa was doomed. Tunis fell. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops were captured, a defeat almost equal in scale to Stalingrad. The consequences rippled across the world. The Mediterranean was reopened. Allied forces could now plan invasions of Sicily and Italy. The United States had gained its first real taste of victory in Europe, and the myth of Axis dominance, whether in the deserts of Africa or the snows of Russia, was shattered. The world could finally see a pattern forming, a slow but unstoppable wave of Allied resurgence, stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, from the Volga to the Atlantic. 1942 had begun with disaster. It ended with triumph. The Allies were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for victory, and as Rommel's forces fled across the sands, and Paulus's army froze in the ruins of a single truth emerged: the Axis powers had reached their high-water mark. From this point onward, every step they took would be backward. The tide had turned. The war and history would never be the same again when the guns finally quieted at the end of 1942. The shape of the Second World War had changed forever. For 3 years, the Axis powers had dictated the rhythm of history. Now, for the first time, that rhythm was broken, replaced by a steady, growing beat of Allied momentum. The shockwaves from Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad were not isolated. Together, they marked a universal shift. Each front that had once been collapsing was now holding and pushing back in the Pacific. The Japanese Empire, once seemingly unstoppable, was beginning to bleed. After the losses at Midway, Japan could no longer replace its destroyed carriers or pilots at the same pace. Its naval aviation, once the pride of the empire, began to wither. The United States, meanwhile, was awakening industrially on a scale the world had never seen. In 1942 alone, American shipyards launched hundreds of vessels: destroyers, escort carriers, Liberty ships enough to replace every loss and then some. New factories built planes faster than Japan could shoot them down. In California, Boeing's B-17 production lines ran day and night. In Chicago and Detroit, engines, munitions, and armored vehicles rolled off assembly lines like clockwork. And at sea, US submarines prowled Japan's supply routes, sinking tankers and transports vital to its war machine. Slowly, methodically, the Japanese Empire began to choke on its own. Overextendsion. In Europe, the psychological transformation was even more profound. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, had discovered its confidence. The victory at Stalingrad turned Soviet despair into defiance, where once the Wehrmacht advanced unchecked. Now German soldiers found themselves defending, retreating, and fortifying ground they could no longer afford to lose. For the first time, Hitler's generals began to doubt the infallibility of their Führer. His obsession with holding every inch of conquered territory regardless of logic or supply became a strategic noose. The German people, still reeling from news of the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, sensed what Goebbels dared not say aloud. The war had turned against them in North Africa. The remnants of Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps were in full retreat across Libya. Their supply lines, harassed from sea and air, collapsed entirely. By early 1943, the last Axis forces in Tunisia would surrender, over 250,000 men captured, their tanks rusting in the desert heat. The Mediterranean was no longer a German stronghold but an Allied highway. This victory opened the door to Europe's underbelly: Sicily, then Italy, and eventually the liberation of France. But perhaps the most profound transformation of 1942 was not material, it was moral. The Allies had rediscovered belief. After years of fear and retreat, nations once cornered now saw a path to victory. Britain, no longer isolated, fought with renewed resolve. America, united and industrialized, became the arsenal and hope of the free world. And the Soviet Union, rising from the ashes, proved that endurance could outlast even the fiercest storm. Everywhere, the Axis powers had lost something: they could never regain momentum. Their enemies had learned, adapted, and hardened. Their aura of invincibility was gone, and in its place, the Allies found faith not only in their weapons, but in the shared conviction that tyranny could be defeated. Still, victory was far from near. 1943 would bring blood, sacrifice, and bitter lessons. The war was not ending. It was only entering its most brutal phase. But the course had changed. The Allies now had initiative, industry, and the will to endure. The Axis powers, for all their conquests, had reached the beginning of their decline, and as the last winter of 1942 froze across Europe and the Pacific winds carried whispers of new offensives, one truth echoed through every radio, trench, and factory: the tide had turned. By the end of 1942, the world's balance had shifted. But the Allies understood that victory would require more than isolated triumphs. The war was no longer a series of desperate defensive actions. It had become a global struggle for dominance, requiring coordination, innovation, and sacrifice at every level. In Washington, Roosevelt and his military advisors began to formulate a long-term vision. The United States, having absorbed the shock of Pearl Harbor, now recognized the dual necessity of defeating Germany and Japan simultaneously. American planners accelerated shipbuilding, aircraft production, and tank manufacturing. Thousands of miles away, shipyards in San Francisco, Norfolk, and New York were converting steel into the weapons that would carry the Allies across oceans and continents. In Britain, the focus shifted from mere survival to strategic offense. Churchill and his generals began coordinating with Washington to plan the invasion of North Africa, followed by Italy, and ultimately the liberation of Western Europe. El Alamein had proven that Axis forces could be defeated when preparation, supply, and coordination were aligned. Meanwhile, British intelligence continued to refine its advantage. Ultra-intercepts and code-breaking operations gave the Allies unparalleled insight into Axis movements, allowing preemptive action rather than reactive defense. The Soviet Union, still reeling from Stalingrad, turned victory into momentum. Factories rebuilt and relocated beyond the Urals were producing thousands of T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, and rifles each month. The Red Army reorganized, retraining recruits, integrating lessons learned from bitter defeats, and preparing for large-scale counteroffensives. Zhukov and other commanders used Stalingrad as proof that methodical, coordinated attacks could overcome even the most elite German units. Morale soared as soldiers who had survived the city's ruins now believed that they could drive the invaders from there.